So tonight I want to come to one more group of papyri. They don't serve as a witness to the New Testament text like these other three do, because they concern themselves with extra canonical statements. They're based on perversions of sayings of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels, but they're still found among the enumeration of the papyri. I believe they are papyri number P77 and P78. I don't know if they go past that, but I think they cover at least those two, and that is a group known as the Logia of Jesus, Logia. Very interesting, exciting discovery that was made in Egypt by two American professors at the end of last century. They're more popularly referred to as the Oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus because they were discovered in 1897 in a place known as Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. Oxyrhynchus. Oxyrhynchus. It's a city or a place, a town in Egypt. So they're more popularly referred to as the Oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus. These two professors, Grenfell and Hunt, on January the 12th, 1897, discovered while digging in some old rubbish heaps in this small town of Oxyrhynchus a whole group of tattered papyri. They knew from the discoveries that had been made just a few years before them right here in Egypt that one of the prime places to look for a lot of the old ancient papyri would be in these rubbish heaps where town garbage was carried and burned. And of course it'd be burned on top of what was burned the week before, and pretty soon you're going to have, maybe down at the very bottom of it, layers that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, that maybe whenever that layer was initially set on fire, not everything burned there. And it didn't burn afterwards because so many things were piled on top of it that it stayed preserved down there at the very bottom. And as the rest of it would turn to ash and so forth, it would kind of serve as a preservation material so that these papyri that were down at the very bottom were preserved just like they were 2,000 years ago, just as though they were brand new, except, of course, they had turned somewhat brittle. They recognized on one of these pieces of papyri the word mote, M-O-T-E. Being biblical scholars, they right away thought of Matthew 7. You know, the mote and the speck over there concerning personal criticism in the first 6 verses of Matthew 7. They had their hopes raised that they had found some biblical text. But they didn't. Rather, they found a copy of some early sayings of Jesus, some early extra-canonical sayings of Jesus. I brought a list of these. I thought I'd read a few of them to you to show what these sayings were like. They began digging, I believe, on the 11th and came across these on January the 12th, 1897. It's become famous since then as the Oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus. So here's a few of these. You don't have to write them down, or you can if you think some of them are worth writing down. But these are all on pieces of papyri. So here's one. This would be on a lot of different pieces. They found just thousands and thousands of papyri fragments, not all of them of biblical material. These were biblical material, but they're not a witness to the text because they were done by unbelieving religious people who changed some things according to what the Gospels, anyway, record today. For instance, Jesus saith, except ye fast to the world, ye shall in no wise find the kingdom of God. And except you make the Sabbath a real Sabbath, ye shall not see the Father. You can tell it has a biblical basis there. Where do they get phrases like that? But yet, you don't find that in the New Testament, though. Jesus saith, here's another one. I've got a list of half a dozen or so. Jesus saith, I stood in the midst of the world, and in the flesh was I seen of them, and found all men drunken, and none found I athirst among them. And my soul grieveth over the sons of men, because they are blind in their heart, and see not. Jesus saith, a prophet is not acceptable in his own country. neither doth a physician work cures upon them that know him. Jesus saith, a city built upon the top of a high hill and established can neither fall nor be hid. Jesus saith, thou hearest with one ear, but the other ear thou hast closed. Here's one that I believe has the mote in it. They only have part of this phrase, and this is all they saw to begin with, was just the word mote. It starts in the middle of the sentence and says, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote that is in thy brother's eye. That's very close to the gospel text. Here's another very interesting one. Jesus saith, wherever there are two, they are not without God. And wherever there is one alone, I say, I am with him. Raise the stone, and there thou shalt find me. Cleave the wood, and there am I. In other words, I'm everywhere is what he's saying, which borders on pantheism, when you pick up a rock and he's hiding underneath it. So one very interesting thing this shows us is that many of the sayings of Christ, many of the sayings that are recorded in the gospel, took on a local, and some of these even a heretical flavor, as they were passed down among unbelieving religious people in different parts of the Roman Empire. You see, as time went on, these sayings would be spread abroad. Not everyone would be converted that would be picking up these sayings, but it would sound like a good religious saying. And this is some prophet that was supposed to have lived and died as a martyr for his beliefs and for his cause up in Palestine. And it's very interesting that some people picked this up down in Egypt, and a lot of it was changed, and you see a local and sometimes even a heretical flavor that's been added. These date around the 3rd century A.D., so we're talking about the 200s A.D. Grenfell and Hunt made some more discoveries in 1903, and then over the course of the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, simply turned up thousands and thousands of papyri fragments. The first ones, as I have said, were found in some old rubbish heaps, the garbage dump, in other words, outside of this town of Oxyrhynchus. Later on, they found a lot of them in the wrappings of mummies. You know, they're wrapped up in cloth in order to preserve the mummified body on the inside, and some of this wrapping material was pieces of papyrus. And a third, and probably the most interesting place where they turned up a lot of these fragments here, some of them concerning these sayings or the logia of Jesus, were in several cemeteries where embalmed crocodiles had been buried. You see, the crocodile was felt to be holy and sacred in Egypt. And they stuffed crocodiles full of ancient papyri. You know, it's just like you have a newspaper and you needed to start a fire or something. They took all of this papyri material and stuffed these embalmed crocodiles with it, and then buried them just like Arlington National Cemetery, right in a row. A crocodile here and one right beside it, right in a row, crocodiles. Just dozens and dozens of crocodiles. They stumbled across these things and dug them up, and of course it was a whole crocodile. It had been embalmed. It was preserved down to this day. And then they looked inside of them, and there's whole libraries, whole manuscripts of torn pieces of papyri inside all of these crocodiles. So they found a lot of them. Here is a picture on this page here of one of the Oxyrhynchus pieces of papyri, one of the Oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus. Of course, all of this is in the Greek language here. I found that to be very interesting, to find all of this stuff in embalmed crocodiles. No, not of the crocodiles, just of the... I don't know what they did with the crocodiles. They probably shipped them around to museums everywhere. Now I want to put up some other papyri, ones that we're not going to look at. Those 4 sections, John Ryland's, the P52, the Bodmer 66, 74, and so forth, and the Chester Beatty papyri in the 40s are the most important ones because they give us a witness to the New Testament text. Oxyrhynchus really doesn't. It just gives us some interesting detail concerning what's going on with the New Testament when it's been spread into other areas. But you might want to quickly get this down. I'm giving you a list of some of the most important papyri that attest to the New Testament text. Over here in the far left-hand column, you have the numbers. We're going back to Gregory, Wettstein, Tischendorf, their system of enumerating the New Testament manuscripts. The papyri, pieces of papyrus were known as P, and then a 1 or a 2 or a 3, some numeral as a superscript after it. You remember what this is, the second column here? That's the EAPCR. Remember what that is, the EAPCR? Okay, E, what's that stand for? No, E. Evangelist, that's the Gospels. E would be evangelists, A would be Acts, P, Pauline, C, the Catholic or general epistles, and R, Revelation. Here's the city where it's found today, and this is the date, the far right column, the date or the century, where we're going to date this particular piece of papyri. So I'll go down the list. If you want to write, you can probably write a lot faster if I tell you what's up there rather than keep looking up. We'll go over here with the P's and you can go straight down, and then people on the tape can get it off because they can't see the overhead. P1, P2, P3, P11, P20, P23, P28, P38, P45, P46, P47, P48, P50, P52, P60, P64, 66, 67, 72, 74, 75, and 76. Up to 76, those are our most important ones. I think that Oxyrhynchus would be 77 and 78, and then from 79 to 81, we've got some unknown ones that haven't even been published yet. Of course, that's not all of them. You'd have 76 of them. You've only got 20 or 25 of them right there. Okay, the next column will tell you what's in that, or what's on that piece of papyrus, what's in that manuscript, in the EAPCR designation. So I'll just give you the letter, and you recognize that E stands for the Gospels, A for Acts, P for the Pauline epistles, C for the general epistles, and R for Revelation. So we'll start up with P1. We'll go right down the line. E, 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 P, C, C, E, A, and then a double one, EA, P, R, A. The next 5 are E. Then down to P72 is a C. P74 is AC. 75 is E, and 76 is E. So the only revelation we have is P47. You see, revelation's not found in a lot of these early. Remember, the papyri manuscripts are 1st to 4th century. We don't have revelation attested to very often. The biggest thing is the Gospels, because people were concerned about the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ as being the founder of this movement called Christianity, this belief, this way of life called the Way. So that's why you're going to find more E's for the evangelists, their writings in the Gospels, than anything else. Okay, the next column is where that particular piece of papyrus is found. We'll again start with P1. Philadelphia. I've just given the city on most of them, and you can tell what the country is, or there, the state. P2 is Florence. P3, Vienna, Leningrad, Princeton. P23, of all things, is found at the University of Illinois. Some of these are found in strange places. You wouldn't think they'd have biblical papyri. P28, Berkeley Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. They have a lot of ancient manuscripts in Berkeley. That's P28. P38, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. P45, part of it's found in Dublin, Ireland, and part of it's found in Vienna. P46. Part of it's found in Dublin. Remember, this is a Chester Beatty papyri. Most of it's in Dublin, but different pieces of it went to Vienna, and then also P46 Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan. P47 Dublin, P48 Florence, P50 New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University. P52, what's P52? JRGP 457, John Rylands Papyrus, P52. Found at Manchester College in England. P60 New York, 64 Oxford, then Geneva, Barcelona, Spain, that was P67, then 72, 74, and 75 are at Geneva, and 76 at Vienna. So that's the third column, and the far right-hand column deals with the date of the manuscript. It's just a number like 3 for Philadelphia for P1. That's the 3rd century. So P1 will go down in order again on the 4th and last column, the 3rd century. The next one, the 6th, the 7th, the 7th for P11, 3rd century for P20, P23 somewhere in the early part of the 3rd century, P28 3rd century, P38 somewhere around the year 300. The next one somewhere around the year 250, as well as the next one, P46, somewhere around 250, as well as P47, somewhere around 250. P48, the 3rd century, P50, the 5th century, P52, what's special about that one? It's the earliest witness to the New Testament text. We'll give it the maximum date of 125 AD. Anywhere from 100 to 125. Anywhere from 10 to 35 years after the Gospel of John was written. P60, the 7th century. P64, somewhere around 200. 66, somewhere around 200. 67, somewhere around 200. Then the next one, the 3rd century, the 6th century, the next to last one somewhere in the early part of the 3rd century, and the last one dates the 6th century. All of those years AD because all of them have reference to the New Testament. So there's a partial listing of the most important New Testament papyri that witness to the New Testament text. What their designation is, what material they contain, EA, PCR, where they're found, and what their date is. Just so you'll have it as a point of reference. Okay, I believe that wraps up the papyri manuscripts. The next thing we come to, so we're coming to a new section now for the text of the New Testament, will be the Uncial manuscripts. The papyri date from the 1st to the 4th. The Uncials date from the 4th to the 10th. Now remember that on the pieces of papyri, the type of letters that are used are Uncial letters. But when we're using it as a designation for a name of a type of manuscript, then we're talking about from the 4th to the 10th and not the 1st to the 4th. That would be for the papyri. And I believe tonight we've got time to look at the most important. So we'll look at the 3 earliest, the 3 most important Uncial codices. We're talking now about full-length codices, not about some fragment. Some of the papyri that we showed you last week, they're just little torn pieces, especially like JRGP 457 or P52, just 2.5 or 3.5 inches. There's really, from part of John chapter 18, there's really not much you can get out of that. I mean, it's good that we've got it. I'm not complaining about having JRGP 457 or P52, but I'd rather see these great codices. So that's what we come to next. So the first thing to remember is we don't have any great codices prior to the 4th century. We just don't have any of them prior to this time. Those manuscripts are papyri manuscripts, and they're just not as complete as once we switch over from the material of papyrus to the material of the antelope skins, or the skins of cattle, or the skins of sheep, or the skins of deer. All different types of animals have been used in the past for either parchment or vellum. So we'll start with Aleph, the Hebrew letter Aleph, also known as 01. A number prefixed with a 0, remember, refers to an uncial, and also known as Sinaiticus. The great manuscript Sinaiticus. Now, the story of the discovery of Sinaiticus reads a lot like a mystery novel. It's probably one of the most interesting studies in all of textual criticism. The famous German scholar Constantine Tischendorf, who had traveled all over the world, given his whole life to a search of ancient biblical manuscripts, soon found his way down to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, to Mount Sinai. That's the great mountain of Moses and the law in Exodus 20 in the Old Testament. And a monastery there at the foot of the mountain known as St. Catherine's Monastery, where in 1844 he made one of the most remarkable discoveries in modern times. It's been eclipsed by the Dead Sea Scroll discovery since then, but up until that time is probably one of the most important and most famous discoveries. This St. Catherine's Monastery, he knew, as well as others of the time, that it had been a favorite dwelling place for monks in the 3rd and 4th century A.D. So he was suspecting that if he could get there, he could find some interesting manuscripts. So he arrives in 1844, Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery. And I'll let him tell you the story in his own words. It was at the foot of Mount Sinai in the Covenant of St. Catherine that I discovered the pearl of all of my researches. In visiting the library of the monastery in the month of May in the year of our Lord, 1844, I perceived in the middle of the great hall a large and wide basket full of old parchments. And the librarian, who was a man of information, told me that 2 heaps of paper just like these, molded by time, had already been committed to the flames. They used these to start their fires. What was my surprise to find amid this heap of papers a considerable number of sheets of a copy of the Old Testament in Greek, which seemed to me to be of one of the most ancient that I had ever seen. The authorities of the convent allowed me to possess myself of a third of these parchments, or about 43 sheets, all the more readily as they were destined for the fire anyway. They only let him have a third of them, and then they found out from what he was telling them how valuable they were, and they wouldn't let him have any more after that. So they were using these for the fire. You know, it's cold there in the month of May at the foot of that mountain, and whenever it's time to fire up the old hearth there, they threw all their manuscripts in there and lit them up, and they got the wood going. You know, it's like we'd use newspaper today. They were using these priceless manuscripts of the Bible. See, they'd been deposited there back in the 4th, 5th century A.D., so forth, and now we've got monks who are over 1,000 years later, evidently ignorant monks who really don't know what's going on. And this was even the librarian of the place. All of these were supposed to be under his care. So you see what an interesting story it is. How he is wandering through this monastery and saw a big basket out in the hall filled with all of this junk in it. He went through there and thought, this is the Old Testament in the Greek language. What are you doing with this? Tell him we're firing the old furnace down there in the basement with all of this stuff. So he wanted to take a few of them. He took 43 of 129 leaves. Before, as I said, the monks realized how important these leaves were, and they wouldn't let him have any more. And what he took became known as Codex Frederico Augustanus, from the name Frederick and Augustus. Codex Frederico Augustanus. In other words, it's become separated from the manuscript that we now know today as Sinaiticus, although it really was all the same thing at one time. Now they're in two different places. This first batch that he took in 1844, he's going to come back in 1853 and back again in 1859. We'll get to that story here in a moment. But now we're in 1844, and he gets 43 of the 129 leaves. And what this had, it was the LXX text for 1 Chronicles, Jeremiah, Nehemiah, and Esther. So we've got the Septuagint text for 1 Chronicles, Jeremiah, Nehemiah, and Esther. He took this to the university library in Germany, from which he had been sent, where it remains to this day as Codex Frederico Augustinus. In 1853, he returned to the monastery again and looked everywhere and couldn't find anything, left disappointed, but left vowing to come again. The next time he came was in the year 1857, and this is when he made his most important discovery. He was now coming as an official representative of the Tsar of Russia, which was the defender of Orthodox faith, of the Eastern Orthodox faith of the world of that day. He again makes a diligent search, just like he did in 53, and he doesn't find anything. The night before he's preparing to leave the next morning, he's sitting up late at night talking with a monk that he had met there in the monastery. Of course, there'd be a lot of them scampering around, chanting and planting vegetables and things like this. And he had met one that he'd become friends with, and he's sitting up with him late at night telling him about this discovery that he'd made back in 1844. And by the way, as time has gone on, some of these monks who were there in 44, in the first place, some of them have gone on now to other monasteries to complete their monastic life. And those that remain behind don't remember. We're talking about almost 20 years earlier whenever he was here making this discovery. A lot of them don't remember what happened to those. That'd be another 86 leaves. He took 43 of that 129 that he saw in that basket. He saw them, and boy was he upset whenever he had to leave with only 43 of them, because he knew there's 86 more of them that's going into the fire. Until, of course, the monks found out how valuable they were, and they decided not to burn them, but he didn't know what happened to them, and neither did anybody else. So the night before he was going to leave, as I say, he was staying up talking late with one of the monks, and began relating this story to him, and all of a sudden that fellow remembered. He said, I've got something that may be of importance to you. So again, I'll let him tell it to you in his own words. He took down from the corner of the room in which we sat and talked a bulky kind of volume wrapped up in a red cloth and laid it before me. I unrolled the cover and discovered to my great surprise not only those very fragments which 15 years before I had taken out of the basket, that would be the other 86, but also other parts of the Old Testament, the complete New Testament, in addition to the Epistle of Barnabas and part of the pastor or part of the shepherd of Hermas. So here this fellow had that whole manuscript wrapped up in a red cloth on a shelf there in his room. And it's just remarkable, the providence of God, that he was talking to this fellow the night before he left, or that may never have been discovered at that time. So here's what it contained. Contained half of the Old Testament, contained all of the New Testament, except the ending that we have of Mark 16. Sinaiticus does not have the King James Mark 16 ending. And it also didn't have the pericope de adultera. Remember the John chapter 8 passage. It didn't have that. We've shown you before that the Mark 16 passage is valid and the John 8 passage is not valid. It also contained the whole Apocrypha, as well as the Shepherd of Hermas, as well as the Epistle of Barnabas. This was all together in one huge stack. Originally, there had been 730 leaves. You can figure this up by determining how many leaves does the Gospel of Matthew take up, and then compare Matthew with with some other portion of the Old Testament that you don't have now, and you could figure out, well, how many leaves would that portion take, so you could figure out how many leaves it originally had. All he got was 390 leaves. 242 of the Old Testament, we're talking about biblical leaves now, and 148 of the New Testament. The material was made from antelope skins. The pages measured 13 by 14 inches with 4 columns to a page, beautiful writing, 48 lines in each of these columns, with no accents, with no breathings, and with the evident hands of at least 3 copyists at work in the whole manuscript. And with the evident hands of at least 3 copyists at work in the whole manuscript. Before I go on, here's a picture of St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. Just a reservoir to this day of ancient biblical manuscripts. Then here is Codex Sinaiticus before it was bound. Here are the leaves. They had to get it bound together so it would stay together. Here's the first page of Romans chapter 1. You can see 4 columns, and I counted it up to make sure it's 48 lines. On every column has 48 lines. Beautiful writing, easy to read, no accents, no breathing marks, no punctuation, and so forth. It dates around 350 A.D. It was purchased from the monks in 1859 by the Tsar of Russia through the hand of Tischendorf for what then amounted to $6,750. During the Bolshevik Revolution, the Red Revolt in Russia in 1917, it passed into the hands of the Russian government, who then sold it to the British government on December the 25th, 1933, for $500,000. Financed World War II for the Russians, I guess. And it's on permanent display today in the British Museum. Here's another clearer picture. This isn't of one page, it's of different columns. You probably can't see the shades of gray, but this isn't a whole column. This is all the column. Then this is from another page and that from another page. But that's how clear the writing is from Codex Sinaiticus. This is generally, it dates AD 350, and it's generally considered to be the best complete New Testament codex available. The best witness to the New Testament text. And it's the only ancient uncial to contain all of the New Testament. The others that we're fixing to study don't contain the whole New Testament. This contains all of the New Testament. So, there's a little history of Sinaiticus. Very important manuscript. Very interesting. And I'm just giving you some excerpts of the history of Tischendorf and his traveling around the world looking for a manuscript like that. Of course, you're not looking for that because you don't know that it exists, but you have suspicions that with monks having lived here in the 3rd and 4th century A.D., there are going to be a lot of manuscripts here. Then of all things, in 1976, 8 more leaves were discovered, but they've not been published yet. And where were they discovered? At the same monastery. You just wouldn't believe these monasteries, the hidden chambers, the rooms everywhere. The little nooks and crannies where bones and teeth and everything are stuck, as well as a lot of manuscripts. And so when you've got people dying off the scene, nobody knows behind what stone. You know all the secret passageways in Dracula's castle or something. You don't have any idea where all these things are hidden until somebody stumbles across it sooner or later. So you see, we're still missing half of the Old Testament from Codex Sinaiticus. We're talking about the whole Bible here. We're using this as a reference to the New Testament because that's where it's most important, Because for the Old Testament, it's not written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek. It's a testimony to the LXX textual family, but it's not nearly as important as things like Dead Sea Scrolls that are written in the Hebrew language. So that's why we're studying it not under Old Testament text, but under New. But in 1976, just a few years ago, 8 more leaves from the Old Testament, I don't remember what book they were from, were discovered, which only means there are more leaves of this Sinaiticus manuscript somewhere in that monastery. But the monks just aren't going to let everybody in to snoop all over the place and disturb sacred bones and pieces of hair and pieces of the ark and the cross and everything else they had hidden in there. Some of those stories get ridiculous. The angels carried Mary's house from Palestine all the way up into Europe, carried her whole house. There's lots of legends about different things that the angels have done for the Catholic people to make sure they have lots of the cross. I think I've said before, if you ever put all the pieces of the cross together, you'd sink a battleship if you tried to put the thing on there. And if I said that, I think I got it from either Luther or Calvin, one or the other, because I believe they were probably the first to say it. But I remember reading somewhere that it was known that enough pieces of the cross existed in enough monasteries all over the world you could sink a battleship. You could sink a battleship, which shows they're not all genuine, which shows probably none of them are genuine. Well, we'll study that whenever we look into Catholicism. It's remarkable, some of those traditions I can give you about the Catholics. Oh, we might tell you some traditions about the Baptists as well, because they're just as bad. Well, let's go on to another great Uncial, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex A, Codex 02. Now, it has an uncertain early history in Egypt. We really don't know how it got to Egypt. It's seen there as early as the 11th century A.D., but we know that it was carried by a man named Cyril Lucar, L-U-C-A-R, Cyril Lucar, from Alexandria to Constantinople whenever his patriarchalship was transferred in the year 1620. He was a great Eastern Orthodox patriarch in the church at Alexandria. He was transferred, this is ecclesiastical business transfer, to Constantinople in 1620. And he carried this manuscript, Alexandrinus, with him, Codex A or Codex 02. And as a gift, he gave it to the British ambassador of Turkey, Sir Thomas Roe, R-O-E, who was in turn supposed to present it to King James of England whenever he finished his furlough in Turkey and returned to Great Britain. By the time he reached England, James was dead and he had been succeeded by Charles I in 1627. So what's interesting about that little bit of history is that it arrived in England just a little bit too late to be used by the translators of the King James Version, which was done in 1611. It doesn't make it there until 1627. Just a little bit too late to be used by those who translated the King James Bible. It was placed in the Royal Library of Charles I, which was later incorporated into the British Museum in 1757, where it's found today. Of the 820 original leaves, 773 remain, which means almost all of it. But here's the proportion: 630 Old Testament leaves and 143 New Testament leaves. The vellum that's used is very thin beyond what's been discovered in most regards since that time. Measures 10 inches by 12 inches each page, with 2 columns per page, and anywhere from 50 to 51 lines per column. As you'll see in some of these pictures I'm going to show you, we've got around this time the rise of the use of ornamentation, different little designs drawn on the pages, as well as you can see in the first line of each book, it's written with red ink instead of the typical black ink to kind of catch your attention, catch your eye. So it's what we call the rise of the ornamentation in the manuscripts. Here's what it contains. It contains most of the Old Testament, except some small portions of Genesis, 1 Samuel, and Psalms. And it contains all of the New Testament, except Matthew, I believe the vast majority of Matthew, like from chapter 3 to chapter 25. I'm just guessing, but it's something like that. It doesn't contain that portion of Matthew. A few parts in the Gospel of John, and a large section in 2 Corinthians. So see, in that regard, it's not as valuable as Sinaiticus, because Sinaiticus contains all of those parts that Alexandrinus leaves out. It also includes 1st and 2nd Clement, as well as the Psalms of Solomon. And it dates from the middle of the 5th century. So we're talking about 100 years later than Sinaiticus, around 450 A.D. Here's a picture of it. Remember, Sinaiticus had 4 columns per page. In other words, the columns would not be as broad as this. This only has 2 columns. Sinaiticus, I believe, had 48 lines per column. This is sometimes 50, sometimes 51. Why that, nobody knows. It's not like 50, 51, 50, 51. It's just sometimes it's 50, sometimes it's 51 lines per column. You're not going to be able to tell. I believe this is the first page of the Epistle to the Romans. You're not going to be able to tell that that red ink has been used here. I'll have to show you another picture. This is Alexandrinus, 450, just after the time of Augustine, just after the time of Jerome. It was around when it was written, which means we're going very early. But notice we're not going to the time of P52, 125 A.D. We're 3 centuries after that. Doesn't mean it's not as valuable. Just means that it's not as early. I'll have to try to find another picture I think I had with me that gives you a better view of some of the ornamentation. Well, you can see the letters have begun to be made real big. This is the actual size of the type. Here's a big letter here. Here's some little designs drawn down here at the bottom. You can see some big letters here. Little squiggle marks made in different places. I've got some other pictures. I don't know where they are right now. I just try to bring the ones that I can remember that have all types of little designs drawn. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that, but it just shows that people are getting careless by this time. You're supposed to be copying the New Testament text and not playing cartoons on the side. So when you see that alerts you to the fact these manuscripts are not going to be as valuable as the early ones. You just have to put 2 and 2 together on things like that. If you're wasting your time drawing smileys beside Paul's great epistle to the Romans, then we're going to have trouble with your manuscript when we're going to compare it with Sinaiticus. That's the old ecclesiastical traditions. They just begin to have fun and not take these things very seriously, and as a result, we end up with what we've had. Okay, the third great uncial manuscript is Vaticanus, B03. Many times it's considered to be just as reliable and just as good as Sinaiticus. In other words, sometimes one is better than the other in certain parts, and then at other times and in other places, the other one will go before the first one. So Vaticanus and Sinaiticus would probably parallel each other as being the most reliable early codices of the New Testament text, the best witnesses to the complete New Testament text. It is known to have existed as early as 1475, when the first catalog was made of the contents of the Vatican Library. Vaticanus, obviously, it belongs to the Catholic Church. It's in the Vatican Library. The first catalog of all of these manuscripts in the Vatican Library was made in 1475. We have a record of that, and Vaticanus is listed as one of the manuscripts available in the library at that time. Of course, that doesn't mean it was written then. It just means that we know that it's been in the Vatican Library as early as 1475. How much earlier than that, it's impossible to say. But it was guarded so jealously and so closely by the popes that Western scholars were not even allowed to see the manuscript for centuries and centuries. Its existence was known by Western scholars as early as 1587. They wouldn't have had a copy of the 1475 catalog for the contents of the Vatican Library, so they wouldn't have known in 1475 that there was any such thing as Vaticanus, that it even existed. But it was known to have existed by Western scholars as early as 1587, when somehow the information leaked out from Vatican Library to scholars in the Western world, Protestant scholars for the most part, but they still weren't allowed to see it for hundreds and hundreds of years. In 1809, the French general Napoleon figures in the story of Vaticanus. When, after he took over Italy, he carried Vaticanus to Paris with him as a prize of war and kept it in his own possession in Paris until it was returned to the Vatican in 1815. And while it was in Paris, it was studied by a Roman Catholic professor at Tübingen University, and it was only at this time that the great age of the manuscript was known. And this work was done by a Roman Catholic scholar and professor. He wasn't down at Vatican looking for it. It came to Paris, and he was a professor at Tübingen University. And so he borrowed it, I suppose, from Napoleon. And it was only at this time that the world in general gained an appreciation for the great age of the manuscript. People knew that it existed, but maybe it was a minuscule manuscript, which means it's a 10th to 14th century one. Or maybe it's an 8th century Uncial manuscript. No one knew how old it was, at least no one outside Vatican. Then in 1843, Tischendorf, and in 1845, Samuel Tregelles were allowed to look at it briefly in the Vatican Library, as long as they promised they would not copy any of it down. But the latter of these men, Samuel Tregelles, had a brilliant memory. You know the rest of that story. He told him he wouldn't write any of it down, but didn't promise that he would memorize large portions of it, which is exactly what he did, which was a great help to the Western scholars. You see, it's pretty fun to be an archaeologist whenever you can make the big discoveries. It's no fun when you just discover dead mice under the stones and you can't find any manuscripts. But it's pretty interesting. It's like a cloak and dagger game is what it amounts to. We told you before with, I believe, Yegil Yadin in a little part of the little postscript to the Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries concerning this so-called temple scroll that Yadin bought. Remember, he had a letter from a clergyman in Virginia that asked for $1 million for it, and he ended up paying the fellow a $10,000 down payment and never saw the $10,000 again. Lo and behold, right in the middle of the Six-Day War, it turned up with an antiquities dealer right in Bethlehem, because he had part of it as a surety whenever he sent the $10,000 to the fellow in Virginia. And so that piece matched right onto the manuscript. And I remember Yadin himself said it's a cloak and dagger game. It's very exciting. It's very interesting. But you can lose a lot of money in a hurry if you get taken like he just did. And so I guess you could say Rome got taken here by Tregelles, because he memorized large portions of Vaticanus, and then whenever he got away from there, wrote it all down, and they studied it, and they saw how ancient the text of it was. You couldn't see the actual pages, but you could see that the way that the letters had been made. It wasn't until the year 1890 that a photo facsimile was finally made of the Old Testament, and another one in 1904 of the New Testament, so that all the scholars who were interested in the world could avail themselves of the text. Of the original 820 leaves, we have 759. 617 from the Old Testament and 142 from the New Testament. On each page we have 3 columns of 42 lines each. The pages are square of all things, 10 by 10. Not a rectangle as most of them are. It was a square, 10 by 10, 10 inches by 10 inches. Here's a picture of first page of the Epistle to the Romans in Vaticanus. And you're going to see a few little marks of ornamentation made, but it was made by later scribes. It obviously was not made, you can tell by the writing of the hand of the scribe. It was not done by the one who copied the manuscript. But you can see it's on this page right here. You can see the little designs that have been made on there. That was made in later years. So in other words, that doesn't hurt the validity or the antiquity of the manuscript itself. It dates 350 AD as well, just like Sinaiticus. They date right around the same time. You'll hear about half of the scholars say that Vaticanus came earlier, and about half that would say Sinaiticus came, and nobody knows. So we just date them the same year to be safe, around 350 AD. And here's what it contains. It has most of the Old Testament, except the following. Most of the book of Genesis, some of the book of 1 Kings, and about 20% of the book of Psalms. Those leaves, in other words, are missing. It contains the Apocrypha, except the following. 1st and 2nd Maccabees and the prayer of Manasseh. And in the New Testament, it contains all of the New Testament except Hebrews 9:15 onward, which takes out James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and the book of Revelation, which means it's missing a lot of the New Testament. Stops right in the middle of that passage on the testator in Hebrews 9:15. So it is the prized treasure of the Roman Catholic Church. It's their number 1 manuscript, and it's still today in the Vatican Library. Okay, I think we've got enough time probably to go on. Let's do one more, and we'll stop after one more. Those 3, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Vaticanus, are known as the 3 great New Testament uncials. They're the 3 most important ones. So that's why we're covering them first, and you notice that they're listed first, 01, 02, and 03. So, I didn't plan to have this much time, but since we do, we'll go on and cover 04. Codex Ephraemi, Codex C, or Codex 04. These will be on your list, I believe, that you've got, your outline. Ephraemi. Just like we said about Alexandrinus, it probably has an early Egyptian origin, but we really don't know much about that early origin. We know it was brought to Italy in the year 1500 by John Lascaris, Lascaris. And then it was acquired in 1533 by the famous Italian Catherine de' Medici, who was the wife and the mother of many of the famous French kings who came after that. You probably remember studying Catherine de' Medici in high school or college or something. She was the wife and mother of a number of French kings. Can you be the wife and the mother at the same time? Yes, she was, the wife and the mother of many famous French kings. At de' Medici's death, the manuscript Ephraemi was placed in the National Library of Paris, where it remains today. What it is a palimpsest rescriptus. So we're to our first very important palimpsest rescriptus. And this is what brings us to the story of the name of the manuscript, Ephraimi. And here's how the history goes. Due to the scarcity of vellum in the 13th century, the biblical text of the manuscript was erased so that the sermons of a well-known 4th century Syriac father whose name was Ephraim could be written on it. It was a manuscript of the Bible, and because he just didn't have enough material for him to write his sermons on, then he took this biblical manuscript and erased the text, or scraped. You really can't erase it, but you scrape the text off of it. We call it erased. And then printed his own sermons on there. Tischendorf, in 1843 and in 1845, by means of some chemical agents that he had, was able to decipher most of the text, which he published in these 2 years, 1843 and 1845. Notice whose name we're back to again, Tischendorf. He had something to do with just about everything. In 1958, Robert Lyon reread the New Testament, and he made some corrections from Tischendorf's text. Today they use ultraviolet rays in order to penetrate, in order to see what originally was there underneath the present handwriting. You can read, because the text underneath is a lot lighter as compared to the darker text that would go over the top. So Tischendorf was fooling around with it, and he was able to decipher a good bit of it. But it was redone in 1958 by Robert Lyon, where he made corrections from Tischendorf's text. And here's what we have in Codex Ephraimi. Now, it's not as important as the other three, but at least down to 06, we're talking about important codices. So it's good to be familiar at least with these names. We're not going to go through all of them. There's so many of them. But we're going to just discuss the history of the first ones, 01 through maybe 06, because they're important ones. All of the Old Testament is missing except. The other ones we said all of the Old Testament was there except. But for Ephraimi, all of the Old Testament is missing except parts of Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Psalm. It also contains the Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus. And in the New Testament, small portions of numerous books are missing, but the most important books would be 2 Thessalonians and 2 John, because these entire books are missing, all of 2 Thessalonians and all of 2 John. And then bits and pieces of a lot of the other New Testament books. That's why we're moving it further down on the line as being not as important as the first three. The pages measure 9 inches by 12 inches with one wide column of approximately 41 lines. Corrections were made by 2 scribes in the 6th and 9th centuries. And it dates around the middle of the 5th century AD, around the year 450. So it's known as Ephraimi or as Ephraimi Rescriptus. Now, you might want to look at this if you could see it up here or see it on the camera, because you can see here's Ephraim's sermons. He was a 4th century Syriac father who, because they didn't have enough manuscript available in the 13th century, people, whenever they were copying his sermons over, erased this manuscript and copied them down. And so you can see he's got 2 columns for his text, and that's what's dark. Then you can kind of see what's underneath it. It's one wide column. It's not 2 columns for the biblical text. It's just one long, wide column that covers the whole page. And that's the biblical text underneath that. And you had to be able to read through the 2 darker columns on top of that to get the text of it underneath it. Very interesting manuscript. 04 Ephraimi Rescriptus. Okay, that's a good place to stop. Then we'll start with Codex Bezique next time, and I just think we'll probably finish textual criticism next week then. We'll go through the remaining uncials that we want to look at. We'll go through the minuscules, and we'll go through the lectionaries. We'll put all those up on overhead like we did this evening with the papyri for you to get down the important uncials, minuscules, and lectionaries. So be prepared to listen like you did tonight and write quickly on getting those things down off the overhead.
Lord, in every way, I want to learn to walk with you, Lord, day by day, with you always there to guide me, hand in hand with you beside me, walking in your spirit day by day. Learn to appreciate you, Lord, in every way. I want to learn to walk with you, Lord, day by day. With you always there to guide me, hand in hand right beside me, walking in your spirit day by day. I want to learn to appreciate you, Lord, in every way. I want to learn to walk with you, Lord, day by day. With you always there.